next speaker is Sam Morrell.
Okay, so hello everyone. I am Sam Morrell. I'm from the University of Exeter. So I'm from the University of Exeter, and I'm working with Professor Tim Naylor on understanding the radii of M-dwarf stars. Now, when it comes to determining the properties of stars, which of course are mass, radius, temperature, and luminosity, there are a load of different methods at our disposal. Now, these methods generally, well, they determine property pairs, any three of which can define an entire star. So when you're actually trying to determine these properties, or when you're trying to compare methods, it's difficult to know which plane you actually want to compare them in. We have opted for this talk to go for the temperature radius plane. So what we do is we start off here by plotting the 1 and 4 gigayear isochrones from Baraf et al. 2015 and the Dotter et al. 2008 models. And what we've also done is we've added the interferometric stars from Boyajian et al. 2012. Now, interferometric stars, of course, have their radii directly determined by interferometry, and then you can do an SED fit to determine their luminosity. So, what we end up here is a trend that may or may not agree with the models, but we really don't have enough evidence to actually determine this. So what we do is we're going to add in further detached eclipsing binaries from John Southworth's DebCat Catalogue and also Parsons et al. 2018. Now, what I've done is just made sure that the uncertainty in the temperature and the radius added in quadrature is less than 4% for all of these, so they're good quality. And what we can see here is that it's generally thought that eclipsing binaries, due to their rapid rotation, are overinflated compared to other main sequence stars. But interestingly still, we also know that Parsons et al. Noted a scatter in the main sequence M-dwarfs. So we don't have enough to really dispute that. But the ever more interesting thing is that we can actually change the result that we get from these just by removing, say, these three here. So we can choose which distribution we want to sample by just changing the sample that we draw from them. So we want to go and add more models to really, more observations to really test this out. So what we've done also is added on the Mann et al. 2015 sample here. And what they do is they use spectroscopy to determine the temperatures, and they use luminosity fit via an SED, hence T spectroscopic and luminosity by the SED. Now, we've noted these here, T spectroscopic and T effective, and that's because the interferometric actually are an effective temperature. And the interesting thing between these samples is that the effective temperature and the spectroscopic temperature need not necessarily agree, but we would hope that they would do. So the problem we have here, or the interesting thing, is that we still have evidence of this scatter here. But we don't really understand the uncertainties in these samples well enough to say whether it's just a result of maybe the uncertainties in the sample, or if it's actually an intrinsic physical spread here. Furthermore, we're dealing with very, very bright sources, and they're very intrinsically red as well. So actually, characterizing the SED completely with these, using these methods is very difficult because you end up saturating in all sky surveys. So what we want to do is to assemble a sample using Gaia DR2 to actually determine the temperature and radius of this sample and see if this scatter and this inflation off of these models is real. So how have we done this? Well, first off, I would like to put in the obligatory Gaia DR2 made this possible. Thanks to the precision parallaxes and the high-quality photometry in Gaia DR2, we can actually put this sample together. So we start off taking the parallaxes, but we don't simply invert them. We take the geometric distances of Baylor-Jones et al. 2018, as they do a correct Bayesian treatment on them, adopting reasonable priors, and they also correctly deal with the asymmetries and the uncertainties of the distances. So that's very important. Just to add in something here, we know that the systematic uncertainty in the Gaia parallaxes can be up to about 0.1 milliarcseconds. So what we do is we pick stars that are closer than 100 parsecs for this sample, because that ensures that we can get to 1% uncertainty or better without being affected by the systematic. So when all is said and done, we have this initial sample, which is just under 100,000 stars. So what we do now is we want to directly determine the temperature and the radius for all of these stars. So what we do is we take photometry from all sky surveys that samples the entire SED so that we can fit these things from it. So we, of course, adopt the Gaia BP and RP bands for the optical. We take a red cut, which means that we only take the bands BP minus RP is greater than 1.5. Then, to characterize the blackbody peak, we adopt 2MAS, and we force that all of the signal to noises of these bands is better than 10, or better than or equal to 10, sorry. And finally, for actually pinning the Rayleigh-Jeans tail down here in the mid-infrared, we adopt W1 through W3 of all Ys. Now, no, we do not use W4, and that is for two very good reasons. First off, the photometry in W4 is relatively poor quality compared to the rest, and it's relatively scarce, so we would be seriously reducing the feasible size of our sample. Second of all, if you look here, there's seldom little flux down in the SED when you get to W4. So when you get past W3, there's a point of diminishing returns, so we really don't need to worry about W4 for these kind of stars. So in all Ys, we force that all of these bands be free of contamination, they be a point source, they have a signal to noise of better than 3, and just to be extra stringent with our photometric cuts, we force that the uncertainty in W3 is better than 5%. So now that we've done a stringent cut in photometry, we additionally perform post-processing to actually flag contaminated sources here. So we know that Gaia, the BP and RP bands in Gaia, have relatively large apertures to them for the photometry. So that means that you can suffer contamination from things like the sky background or nearby sources. So what we do is we follow the methodology of Evans et al. 2018, and we actually use the flux-excess ratio, which is basically the flux in the BP and RP bands, compared to the G band, which is a much smaller aperture, to actually flag bad contaminated sources. So an example of that is in this plot here, where you can see our well-behaved photometry here are these blue data points, and the ones that scatter upward from this line here are further than 3 sigma away, and we flag them as contaminated. Also, we know that you can have astrometric contamination in Gaia, which can result from things like binaries or crowded fields. So we also flag those sources with large values of astrometric chi-squared as contaminated. So at this point, what do we have? We have a final output catalogue with robust distances with uncertainties that are better than 1%. We take stringent cuts on all our photometry from all sky surveys to make sure that we have reliable photometry. We additionally perform post-processing to flag further contaminated photometry. And when we remove all of the flagged stars with the final photometry cuts, we end up with a sample of 15,350 M-dwarf stars. So what do we do with this sample? We perform an SED fit on them. So we take synthetic photometry, which is generated using the CI-FIST atmosphere grid from Elad et al. 2011, and we fit these synthetic photometry to the observed photometry that we've assembled together. And what we can do with this is we use the SED itself to fit the luminosity, and then we use the shape of the SED, which, remember, encodes things like the black body and the opacities of the atmospheres, to actually fit the temperature. Hence, we have an SED temperature from this, where we add the third measure of temperature to this. And what we have here are a few examples of our fits from the minimum, median, and maximum W3 uncertainty sample. So what does this look like if we put it on the plot? It looks a little bit like this. So I will stress now that, that the results are preliminary at the moment. We're still completing the final bits of analysis, and the paper with the method that we've used, as well as this sample, will be published very, very soon. But what we can see here is immediately some really interesting things. First off, we notice that the detached eclipsing binaries here do actually appear to not be overinflated compared to the majority of stars in this plot. More interestingly as well, the Mann et al. Sample temperatures appear to be systematically warmer than our sample. But even more interesting is that there is still this very, very clear scatter on the sequence. And we want to know, finally, is this a result of the intrinsic physical scatter on this sequence, or is it the result of uncertainties? So what we've done is we've taken a small subset of our stars and done a full 3D grid search on them so that we actually get the 68% confidence contours in temperature radius space. Now you can see that for anything to do with characterization of radius, or radius inflation rather, we have a problem here because these are strongly correlated, which means that in order to determine the radius inflation, we actually have to trace upwards from the isochrones, or we actually have to trace along lines of constant luminosity, rather, along the isochrones. But if we transform to a luminosity radius plane, we see that these are practically uncorrelated. And more interestingly still, we see that these uncertainties that we get from this very, very robust fitting cannot describe the scatter that we see in this sequence. So, what we have is we've used our sample to actually show that on average, M-dwarfs are inflated up from the models by an average of 10%. But more interestingly still, there is a 10% scatter either way from this average inflation, which means that an M-dwarf sequence just simply doesn't exist. So, by that, I mean that if I were to say, if you had a stellar physicist say, could you take my mass and give me a radius, or even an exoplanet person say, take my effective temperature and give me a radius, I simply couldn't because they're a degenerate. Okay? So, in conclusion, we've shown that there is an intrinsic physical scatter in M-dwarf radii, meaning that an M-dwarf sequence doesn't exist. We've also presented an all-sky catalogue of 15,000 main sequence M-dwarf stars with determinations of temperature and radius, which we've used to do it. And we've shown that our measure of temperature, the SED temperature, appears cooler than the spectroscopic temperatures that have been determined by Mann et al., which is somewhat surprising given that Mann et al. Have shown that the effective temperature and the spectroscopic temperature are in good agreement. Our paper with, as I said, our paper with the catalogue and the methodology behind this is in preparation and it will be submitted very, very soon. Thank you everyone for listening, and if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
So, are there any?
Does the scatter extend uniformly over all M-dwarf types? And if so, does it then extend further into other spectral types?
That's a good question. So all we've been able to show here is that it's in the late Ks somewhat and in the early Ms, but we've basically hit the IMF limit for how far we can go down for this experiment. So I don't know is the honest answer.
So Paddy Leahy, Manchester, would you like to speculate what's going on here?
If I had to speculate, I would have to say it was stellar magnetism. But not necessarily stellar magnetism that's happening at the moment, but I might suggest that it was the result of stellar magnetism early in the star's evolution, and the star is still collapsing down. And that's for all of these main sequence, but it's pure speculation, unfortunately, at the moment.
Same question as Paddy's.
James Jackman, University of Warwick. So you just mentioned potentially about stellar magnetism. Mm-hmm. Have you looked into seeing how the radii might vary in regards to like the X-ray luminosity?
Yes, I have.
Oh, good.
Would you like to see a plot?
I would love to see a plot.
Okay. Right, where is it? Right, so I don't know if you can see it very well, But what we have on this plot, which is going to be published very, very shortly, are key indicators of activity in stars. And we've been very careful here to deal with the extraneous correlations in the rotation period here, the H-alpha luminosity here, and the X-ray versus bolometric luminosity here. So we've dealt with the errant color correlations here. And when we subtract that, we can actually see absolutely no correlation whatsoever in main sequence stars for, well, we can't confidently say, we can't disprove the null hypothesis on this one. So I would have to say no based on this data set. But it's only for hundreds of stars from our sample of 15,000.